Brian Hart.
Hello, my name is Brian Hart. I'm from Massachusetts, and I'm one of the few that was able to overcome parental alienation with my 3 children in 2008 and 9. 3 years ago, I started a parent support group for parental alienation, and I've supported over 200 parents in that group, and it grows about 2 parents per week. I congratulate you and thank you for addressing this with the judicial and children's committees and creating this forum. It's hard for people to understand parental alienation unless you experience it. So I really empathize with people that just don't get it. I still have difficulties sharing it with people and letting them know, people who haven't experienced it. It's hard for them to comprehend that their children would turn against them for any reason. But it's actually very easy. If you look at cults where adults are indoctrinated into the cult, think about a child growing up and depending on their parents and trusting a parent. And so it's very easy to indoctrinate children. And so to put a little scope on it, what we're talking about is about the 15% of child custody and divorce cases that actually reach judicial decisions. 85% reach agreement of normal, healthy-minded parents that can agree on things and share the children properly and easily. So about the 15% of these cases that reach trial, they're typically referred to as high conflict parents. And I'd cross out the S on the end of parents. I'd make it's a high conflict parent. You have an aggressor, and then you have a defensive parent who's just trying to protect a relationship that they have with their children so their children have at least one healthy-minded parent to help guide them and teach them about life. And it's and judges and many lawyers and even mental health professionals are unfamiliar with personality disorders. And that's what we're dealing with. And the personality disorders we're talking about, the most common one is a borderline personality disorder. The second most common is narcissistic personality disorder involved in parental alienation, and also sociopathic personality disorders, and a couple others are paranoid, histrionic, and dependent personality disorders as defined by the DSM. And so when a judge will say, and many do, it's a high conflict situation, can't these 2 parents just go out in the hallway and meet with a court officer and work it out? I don't want to deal with this. That's a little bit analogous to telling a rape victim to go out in the hall with the rapist and saying, can't you figure it out? Because that parent, one of the parents, is a victim of coercive domestic violence. That's what an alienator perpetuates, not only on the other parent, but also as the experts discussed earlier, it's psychological abuse to a child. So what you have is an unacknowledged form of family violence against the children and the other spouse or ex-spouse or other parent. So I think the other underestimation that gets made is the damage to the children. They suffer extreme risks of adverse childhood experiences, which add up to things like severe anxiety, severe depression, suicidality. They have identity challenges because half of them, they're being kind of helicoptered parent. They're told what to do. They're enmeshed with the other unhealthy parent. They're parentified, being treated like a parent. They're infantized, meaning they're not allowed to develop. There's a great book that's titled Raising Adults, rather than a play on not raising children. They don't want to raise adults. They want to raise someone that's dependent upon them their whole life to serve their own needs. Now, I have empathy for the people that have those 6 personality disorders I just mentioned, because they themselves suffered trauma in their childhood. And the reason that those disorders are often referred to as intractable, meaning untreatable, is because when they suffered trauma in their childhood, their neuron development that typically happens in childhood doesn't happen for those folks because of the trauma that's going on. The worry and the stress that they have doesn't allow proper brain development. And that's the unfortunate thing. So while I have empathy for them, I do not want to and do not accept and want to see their children suffer the same trauma that they suffered and create this generational problem. And so what often happens is an alienated child actually goes out and marries a spouse or has children with someone else who they themselves have a personality disorder, because that's what they're familiar with. That's what they think love is, and it's not, and it's dysfunctional. And so the research shows that actually 50% of alienated children actually become alienated parents because of the selection of a spouse or the person that they end up having children with. So it's a very insidious generational continuity that really needs to be stopped. And so there are ways to stop it, and a lot of the solutions have been discussed here, and I'll mention just a few. I think recognition is a big part of it, and certainly there's a lot of well-meaning people that have created this problem, right? The path to hell is paved with good intentions. I don't think that everybody is corrupt, okay? But there's some challenges in the structure, and it's not only Connecticut, it's across the country. It happens to have some extreme prevalence here in Connecticut because there's a lot of money. We've heard today that there's Connecticut is the 5th highest out of the 50 states for the amount of lawyers. It's probably even higher than that on the ranking for GALs, parent coordinator types of individuals, and visitation places and people, and that has become a problem. And certainly absolute power corrupts absolutely, right? And so you almost get like the good judges and lawyers, it becomes a groupthink, and they're influenced by their peers on how the courts should be. And so I think that if we looked at increasing the amount of judicial oversight, accountability, and consequences, would be a great first step. So there's kind of some immediate steps that can be taken, short term, some kind of Band-Aids, and then there's some longer term solutions, such as shared parenting, which the evidence shows, and the peer-reviewed research all shows, that the children are the healthiest when they grow up with both parents, if both parents are healthy. And so there's several great bills that have been proposed, and I think those are great steps towards resolving some of the problems that you've heard the parents describing today. And I think there's a couple people, a couple groups that are the most divisive against shared parenting, which is a solution that is proposed in 30 states and passed in several at different levels with great success. And that is, unfortunately, some of the domestic violence groups who have done tremendous work to protect parents and quite often women that needed protection. But I think the pendulum swung too far. Okay, what has happened is these alienators with these personality disorders, they realize that suddenly they can use the courts to enable the alienation. When I work to help parents, there's two sides of it. There's the legal side, and then there's the emotional, psychological side with the children. So you need to win both. You need to have access and then know how to address this with the children. And both of them are very hard because the alienators don't play by any rules. And they don't care about the children, they care about themselves more. That's an intractability. They can't stop that. We can't train them, we can't convince them. That's not going to stop. So we actually, they are enabled by the court processes and restricting access to the other parent, because even though they have a personality disorder, that does not mean they're not high functioning. They're calm, cool, collected. They present themselves very well in the courts to lawyers. They create what's called negative advocates. And when you have the alienated parents, they're anxious, agitated, afraid. They're suffering from PTSD. They can't present well. So if the alienator gets to the school and describes the problem of this terrible other parent, they're very believable. Everybody feels empathy for them, and that perpetuates this problem. So the courts get fooled by the alienators, and that's part of that empowerment. The courts then act on it, and they perpetuate, enable the alienation. And it's only when a judge can understand it and get convinced, oftentimes by an expert witness, that hopefully there's a good lawyer that is familiar, specialized in this area, knows enough to get a specialized expert witness that's going to educate a judge on a one-by-one basis. But that's difficult and expensive. And not every judge believes it, because there are groups out there, including some domestic violence advocates, that do good work, but they've gone too far and they're too rigid to accept the latest peer-reviewed science, hundreds of peer-reviewed articles. It's settled science by today that of what parental alienation is. And as Dr. Miller said so eloquently, it's like having, looking at a woman's breast for breast cancer, seeing a lump and saying, oh, I don't, it's either malignant or it's benign, but we're not going to look into it. You need to look into this. This is not about, if there's estrangement caused by justified abuse, that is not alienation. And there are tests and ways to identify that are fairly easy to implement. So that's how I would close with the most significant way one of the most significant ways is shared parenting bills and legislation. And that helps to start the judges and doesn't have to make them mental health experts. You start out at 50-50 custody and you go from there. And if a parent doesn't deserve full custody because they were abusive, then you can back that down. So I thank you.
Any questions?
Okay, how effective are the treatment for parental alienation?
The treatments are extremely effective. Okay, so let's define what the treatments are, I guess, because that really shades the answer to my question. There's several programs. There's Turning Points for Families out of the state of New York, and there's Family Bridges. Both have been mentioned in this session by Dr. Miller. Family Bridges travels around the country and will go to any state. The effectiveness rate of them to reunite a parent with a child that was previously rejected to them is in the 95% area, okay? And what happens is, and with Turning Points for Families, they're working on research to show that 42 out of 42 kids that most recently were sent there by judges from 10 different states, 20 different judges, 100% reunification. So what we find is when it's a 4-day program, and usually it requires about 90 days of no contact with the alienator after the 4 days, to have that 100%, that within a day and a half, when they go down memory lane of having the previously rejected parent bringing in pictures of that child, smiling, and videos, and art projects they did, and letters that they wrote for Mother's Day or Father's Day, saying how much they love them, the child's subconscious is saying, I've got to alienate, because they're in survival mode. So they've got to follow this parent who's saying they're the good parent, and they've got to be fearful and think of the other parent as uncaring or unloving or unsafe. So they're saying, okay, I can't hitch my wagon over here as far as survival. I've got to stay with this parent. And they have taught me in a very subliminal way that I've got to denigrate the other parent. And so what the alienator does is they indoctrinate and brainwash the child into thinking this. And then they actually stand back and the child takes over, which is an amazing psychological outcome. It's like the Stockholm Syndrome and the Patty Hearst in the 70s. They associate with that parent, and then they feel like, I have to protect this parent who's my savior. And so they have that campaign of denigration. And then when they are speaking with adults or being questioned about it, you can hear their immature reflectiveness of saying, oh no, that parent's all good. It's the other parent is horrible. And you never hear that in a natural situation. It's amazingly, and when you ask what did the parent you're rejecting do, you hear those trivial things. Oh, I didn't like the art on the wall, and they're just crazy. You heard earlier, oh, they took me to Hawaii. I don't like going to Hawaii. It's craziness, and it's so obvious, so you heard some of those stories earlier. And so when it comes to, and this is a good area to have brought up, when it comes to judges or even lawyers that they want to talk to the child's not qualified. In legal terms, they're under undue influence. Another term would be they're under diminished capacity. There's a paper written by Jamie Rosen in 2013, peer-reviewed, that describes what's happened. They're not of their own power to be able to discuss this.
Yeah, follow up to that. I mean, we've all heard some excruciatingly painful testimony today, some of it which is about mistaken assessments about parental alienation and who is doing the alienating and who is not. As well as, it seems to me that with one of the prescriptions for this is the presumption for shared parenting, which gives both parents access to the child. How do you deal with, given what you and others earlier today have testified about, borderline personalities, for example, about the alienator being presenting, calm, cool, collected, all of this. Ongoing shared parenting situation, one parent who is very buttoned up and smooth and the other one who is fearful and anxious. How do you maintain that equilibrium? How do you put a child through that when we're not suggesting that we remove them from the alienating parent. How do you manage that balance? How does a child manage that balance?
That's a great question. That the anxious, agitated, afraid parent, they lose a lot, if not all, of that anxious agitation and whatnot. They become more of the normal parent that they once were, before that child was ripped away from them. And there does need to be oversight of the previously or continually alienating parent, and they might lose custody if they do not stop the emotional and psychological abuse that's been described. Alienation behaviors are abusive, psychologically, emotionally. They might lose custody, and what happens sometimes is they don't want to split anything. They will actually self-estrange them from the child. They say, if you're not going to follow my indoctrination, if you're not going to reject the other parent, then screw you. I've seen it happen in many cases. And it's unfortunate because that child will yearn for them. In my support group, I just had a mother-daughter. The daughter was completely alienated from 11 to age 18. On her 18th birthday, her father dropped her off at her mother's house. Now, this is after 7 years of being forced to call the stepmother mom and totally ignore her mother, who would go to every one of her high school cheering events and get ignored. But she always sent cards. The daughter cried in front of my group. This was the first time that it was shared in public. It was therapeutic for her to share it with an audience of 40 targeted parents that I assembled. And she went through, she saw my presentation, she said, that is exactly what I went through. And then she went through, what she was indoctrinated to. She actually cried. She turned to her mother in the middle of this group, and she said, is it okay if I explain this? And her mother said, yes. She said, when I was 12, I accused my mother of abuse and had her arrested. And it was when she turned about 16, she started saying to her older brother, this doesn't add up what Dad's been telling us. Mom never hit us. Dad is the one who's the authoritative father or parent. And so one of the reasons the father dropped her off was because she had this older brother that's still indoctrinated to this day, and she had a younger half-sibling that the father didn't want this questioning to be within the environment of his other alienated children. He said, okay, I'll drop you off. She would love to have an ongoing relationship with him, but he's cut off all communications with her. So that's an example. So if there is true abuse from the alienating behavior, from the alienator, they should be removed, and if they're not, sometimes they self-remove themselves. We hope, and we do have a training, so when you get to the therapeutic protocol, when a judge is bold enough and smart enough to see that this child is going to be damaged if they don't do something to take sole custody away from the alienator, there's a protocol for not only the 90 days of no contact and the 4 days of the child with the previously rejected parent, but there's a protocol that the alienator to go to a local therapist that they select and follow the protocol that's been designed for them, specifically for an alienator, to teach them of hopefully how to not alienate. But again, because these personality disorders, if they're severe, are intractable, then it's not going to really work effectively. And 9.1% of adults in the U.S. have a personality disorder, according to the National Institute for Mental Health. So we're talking a big population.
Thank you. Thank you very much for coming.
Thank you.